How highly effective people speak. By Peter Andre. Learning to become a highly effective speaker. Barack Obama, John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., Ronald Reagan, Winston Churchill. Political preferences aside, these 5 men changed the course of history, and they, like all game changers, had one thing in common: they were highly effective speakers. We often think of the ability to speak compellingly and charismatically as something we're either blessed to be born with or doomed to suffer life without. Yet, this isn't entirely the case. While it's true that those who possess the gift of the gab enjoy greater success than those who'd rather lose their left arm than speak in front of a crowd, fluency and eloquence are skills anyone can learn. In fact, the secret behind highly effective communication is rather straightforward. Influential speakers convey their messages how humans are wired to receive them. Simply put, they understand the behavioral economics behind how we take in information and, crucially, act as a result. Essentially, it's only a grasp of a handful of cognitive biases that stands between you and the successful, highly effective speaker you want to be. In this blink, we'll cover 5 of the 9 biases Peter Andre explores in How Highly Effective People Speak: the availability bias, the contrast effect, the zero-risk bias, the halo effect, and attribute substitution. As we define and break down each cognitive bias, we'll look at the practical implications each has on making you and your message more compelling and charismatic. We'll also refer to real-life examples to demonstrate how they've been used to considerable effect, again, political leanings aside, throughout history. While learning to master cognitive biases completely will offer the greatest bang for your buck, becoming proficient at wielding just one will separate you from the pack. First key idea: the availability bias. Imagine 2 people are asked, "How likely are shark attacks?" Instantly, both minds quickly scan their archives for any relevant stored data to inform their response. The first, remembering a particularly horrific incident they once saw in the news, answers, "Very likely." The other, not coming across any relevant stored data, responds, "Not at all." Objectively, the official statistic will rule one more correct than the other, but subjectively, both will believe their memories have steered them correctly. You see, we vastly overweigh the significance of information we can easily recall. This is called the availability bias. The availability bias means that even if we've encountered an objective statistic on a subject, it will do us little good if we can't recollect it quickly. Instead, our brains jump to a single, and therefore, inherently limited, example, most likely a vivid or compelling anecdote. So, what does this mean for effective communication? You can tap into the power of the availability bias by making your message memorable. Of course, it's always good to have facts to support your statements, but if you want them to have influence, they need to be easily retrievable from the archives of your audience's minds. A simple yet potent way to do this is to package information as visual and emotionally arousing stories. Stories have several key elements, but the main ones to focus on are characters and drama. If you can frame your communication in terms of a protagonist, or good guy, versus antagonist, or bad guy, do it. People are adept at imagining and understanding this dynamic. Similarly, emphasize the natural conflict in your message where possible. Even as far back as Aristotle, pathos, the emotional charge of a message, has been recognized as one of 3 essential ingredients in effective rhetoric. To tie this back to the original example, if you want to make the case that shark attacks are frequent and threatening, communicating a single anecdote in the form of a visual, emotionally charged man versus shark narrative is significantly more persuasive than presenting a statistic smorgasbord. For better or worse, the availability bias means accessibility often beats accuracy. Second key idea: the contrast effect. Ronald Reagan's "A Time for Choosing" speech starts by making some clear distinctions. You and I are told increasingly we have to choose between a left or right. Well, I'd like to suggest there is no such thing as a left or right. There's only an up or down. Up, man's old age dream, the ultimate in individual freedom consistent with law and order, or down to the ant heap of totalitarianism. It's not for nothing that Reagan didn't just describe the up or the ultimate in individual freedom, but rather, also included reference to the down and the ant heap of totalitarianism. When the subject of a message is presented in stark opposition to another, the contrast effect is at play. It's a tremendously powerful cognitive bias, but in simple terms, we perceive black as blacker against white than we do if shown black alone. You might not agree with Reagan or his statements, but it's hard to argue with his ability to wield the contrast effect throughout his political career. One way you can hit the contrast effect yourself is by employing the same interplay of antithesis that Reagan's speech did. Up is portrayed against down, the ultimate in individual freedom, against the ant heap of totalitarianism. On the other end of the political spectrum, John F. Kennedy did this by opposing easy and hard when he said, "We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard." Watch any political debate, and you'll likely see this cognitive bias weaponized by one side or the other. Tied to this is clearly outlining alternatives to your recommendation. If you don't acknowledge other options, your audience may feel the information they're receiving is partial and, therefore, potentially untrustworthy. But by enumerating the alternatives, and crucially, showing your recommendation far superior to them, your audience will feel they've had some autonomy in drawing their conclusions. People will voluntarily leap to embrace Reagan's ultimate in individual freedom if the ant heap of totalitarianism is their only alternative. As with all communication strategies that tap into cognitive biases, the contrast effect can serve bad as readily as good. So it's extra imperative that positive forces like you are equipped to use it to maximum benevolent effect. Third key idea, the zero-risk bias. Imagine being offered two investment options. Option 1 has an expected return of $900 with a 100% success rate. Option 2 has an expected return of $1,100 with a 90% success rate. While most people will instinctively jump for option 1, selecting such opportunities based on expected monetary value, or EMV, is best practice, so quickly run the math. The EMV, that is, return multiplied by probability, for option 1 is $900, but $990 for option 2. The zero-risk bias accounts for why most people, albeit not you, fail to appreciate the increased EMV of the second option. You've probably heard humans described as loss-averse. Studies have shown that we experience twice as much suffering from a loss than pleasure from an equal gain. Our wiring is such that we disproportionately favor scenarios with zero risk over scenarios with a chance of uncertainty, even if the latter's potential upside is significantly larger. How many products and services have you seen offer a 100% money-back guarantee? This is a real-world example of the zero-risk bias in action. Because customers feel they can't lose, they'll choose this provider over a cheaper competitor without a guarantee. Yet, this proposition is just as much a win-win for the business. Because the company will attract more, higher-paying clients, they'll come out ahead too, even if they end up dealing with a greater return rate. If your message doesn't lend itself to this kind of guarantee, consider what other pledges you could make. For the most part, it'll be more realistic to point to ways your audience will experience zero risk than an inevitable outcome, so brainstorm what these might be. For instance, say you've started a new, exciting, ethical investment portfolio you genuinely believe will benefit all parties involved. In this scenario, a 100% money-back guarantee wouldn't make sense, and it would be unrealistic to suggest that ROI is assured. But to make your offer distinct and compelling, you'll need to do something to shore up the associated risk in your prospects' minds. Here, you could shift their focus and emphasize another risk-free metric. For example, can you underscore the 0% chance of transaction failure, being kept on hold for more than 5 minutes, or investment in non-ethical businesses? Although these metrics are secondary to the ultimate return, the zero-risk bias will activate nonetheless. Of course, you don't want to make promises you can't keep, but it's certainly worth foregrounding the ones you can. Fifth key idea, attribute substitution. Here's a little-known fact: the expression rule of thumb originated from a rough measurement to determine whether you were in the radiation zone of an atomic bomb. Not everyone had a Geiger counter to hand during the Cold War, so the protection offered instead was that if you see a mushroom cloud, extend your arm, thumb up. If your thumb covers the cloud, you're probably, emphasis on probably, okay. If it doesn't, get out fast. While the threat of an atomic bomb is, fortunately, less common these days, rules of thumb continue to influence how we make sense of the world. Attribution substitution explains why we rely on these mental heuristics as heavily as we do. If presented with a complex, cognitively demanding decision, our brains seek to conserve energy by substituting the challenging proposition with a good enough stand-in. We then apply the answer to the simpler, less cognitively taxing question to the difficult one. Interestingly, this cognitive bias also colors our judgment of others, not just judgments of hard-to-ascertain measures like radiation exposure. For instance, it's generally easier to answer, "What do I think of this person?" than, "What do I think of their message?" Call to mind someone you already oppose. How likely are you to agree with what they say? Exactly. There are a handful of practical implications this bias leads highly effective communicators to. The first is the importance of presenting a shared worldview to your audience. People gravitate toward those who mirror their thoughts and opinions, so take the time to understand who your listeners are and how they perceive the world. The more you can meet them where they are, the more persuasive your message will seem. Second, consider ways to tie yourself and your statements to evidence and/or trusted organizations. Verifying and interrogating information is a laborious process, so for the most part, people spare themselves the labor by quickly scanning to see whether sources are cited, reliable or not, and if there's a connection to a company, institute, or university they recognize, whether a current affiliation or not. These small additions to your message may seem simple, and in a way, that's the point. Give your audience as many indicators that your message is important and accurate, and they'll regard it as such. Finally, it's safe to say that effective communicators understand how humans naturally absorb information, and speak accordingly. Fortunately, anyone can earn this influence through mastery of the theoretical and tactical underpinnings of behavioral economics. The availability bias, contrast effect, zero-risk bias, halo effect, and attribute substitution are all examples of cognitive biases you can wield for good. Even tapping into one will separate you, and your message, from the pack.